part. So if you're not presenting, not going to be in this, this is just sort of for the presenters. So let me go.
Share the slide.
Fabulous, thank you. Oh, I see what you mean, share on this screen. Honestly, we had a long conversation at the beginning about how difficult the space time is going to be for me, and it has proven to be so. Okay, so it's quite simple. But I see it. Okay, brilliant. That's good. So we had a little bit of a tech problem as well. We had a lovely projector and big screen, and unfortunately we've got this now, but hopefully people can see it. Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this event. My name is Catherine Telling, and I'm a lecturer in education at the University of Manchester. Co-organised this event with Tom and Sylvie, so do you mind just saying who you are?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Tom Fry, a lecturer in education as well. So some of my work looks at UCAS personal statements and university admissions, which I'm here to talk to you today.
My name is Sylvie Lola. I'm a student lecturer at Manchester Institute of Education as well, and my lecture is primarily in international student admissions, but fairness in the international context.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the kind of the thinking behind the thinking behind this event today was really about so we're all researchers interested in higher education. Of course, there's lots of kind of outreach work that universities do, you know, around fairer admissions, you know, thinking about you know, how to ensure that all students have a fair shot at getting into university if that's kind of what they want to do. But sometimes it can feel a bit like it's hard to have a joined-up conversation between sort of those two worlds, so that, you know, teachers can get, you know, practical advice and tips about, you know, how to help students and support students with their applications, but at the same time, you know, making sure that that's quite kind of research informed and connected up with, you know, the empirical research that people are doing on some of these questions around, you know, fairness in admissions and making sure that everyone kind of gets a fair shot, really. So that was just the idea, to sort of bring together a few different people doing different types of work in that area. Yes, we have a really interesting mix of people in you know, in different roles. So our first panel, Sylvia will introduce our speakers, and this is hopefully a chance for you to let me go forward. Yeah. So sorry, no, starting with Tom, who's just going to really briefly tell us something a little bit about what's changing in UCAS applications. So I'm sure many of you will know that there's kind of change coming up. There's already been some changes, and there's more changes coming up in terms of UCAS personal statements. So where that's come from and why that's come about. Tom's going to briefly introduce. Then we have some expert speakers talking about some kind of hints and tips to help students with that kind of new application process. Then we'll have a bit of a break, a little bit more tea and coffee, and then we'll have some speakers speaking from a more kind of research perspective about those kind of questions. So it's quite a tight schedule because we ended up with lots of people that wanted to be involved and that we wanted to be involved. So I think we'll kick off now, and I'll hand over to Tom to just tell us a little bit, get everyone up to speed on some of these changes that are coming in from UCAS.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Catherine. I also like the way that you pitched, like, Tom will do this, and then there's a series of experts as well. I appreciate that. Thanks. So just in this first bit, just I'll take about 5 minutes really, just to talk about some of the things that have already changed to UCAS applications that you've probably seen, but just in case anyone's not aware. And then talk a little bit about the changes that are coming for the UCAS personal statement as well. And that's just so that we're all on the same page, because I know there's a few of our experts that are going to be referring to that later. I haven't said experts in quotation marks. That would just be offensive. Okay, so there's been a few recent changes. So if you're involved with UCAS applications, then you'll have seen the change to the reference that came in recently. So shifting that to a series of more structured questions. A big thing that UCAS likes talking about, the 7 new questions on widening participation that are now part of the UCAS form as well. So they're covering various different topics where students are mostly self-declaring some of these characteristics. And I think a really interesting change is the historical entry grades, which I think, So that's giving information about what is the most common grade that people enter onto a course with, what's the highest grade and what's the lowest grade. And I think that's a really useful tool for students and teachers and advisors to get a sense of what universities are actually looking for there, some of the diversity of practice. And some of the smaller bits that UCAS are looking to do moving forward, they're basically looking to verify some of these new questions here and verify some of the additional information. Because yes, these questions are asked, but they're not necessarily being used at the moment by universities because they see it as unverified data. They see it as if you can just declare yourself to be on free school meals, can we use them? So that's something that UCAS are looking at moving forward. So the big change that's coming though for the 2026 entry, so for this next application cycle, is the reform to the personal statement. So we are moving from our friend, the long form free response essay that we've probably all read too many of. And essentially what we're moving to is 3 structured questions. And I've specifically laid it out in this way because I do think there's not a radical change here. It is similar content that is going to be asked for, but essentially we've just gone 1, 2, 3. And the strengths and weaknesses of that, which we can talk about. But a little bit of background, and I'll keep this brief just so that we're on time. Why is this happening? Why has UCAS chosen to do this? So, at least in part, this has been a research-informed decision. So, there's been work from Stephen Jones, who's part of University of Manchester, used to be head of the education department. So he did some work around 2010, 2012, a few different studies that was essentially picking out inequalities in personal statements. So he did a comparison that was looking at those that were state educated and those that were educated in private schools. So he found these differences in terms of grammatical mistakes. So state school students make 3 times as many grammatical mistakes. There was also looking at the rates of people talking about a paid job versus a prestigious kind of work experience with a law firm or with, say, in a hospital. And what Steve found was that for state school applicants, there were 2 bits of work experience for every job, whereas for private school applicants, they spoke about 4 work experience compared with every job that they spoke about. So that's just kind of highlighting that there's really differential access to some of these opportunities that might be rewarded through a UCAS personal statement assessment. I'll skip over some of these as well, but there's widely documented inequalities in terms of mature students, as well as I did some work last year with Steve as well, that was looking at students more generally from disadvantaged backgrounds and finding some inequalities in that area. So a question that we often get asked is like, does that matter? And the best piece of evidence we have at the moment is from Vicky Bolivar from 2013. And essentially what she found was that if you're comparing working class state educated applicants, they were 2/3 as likely to get an offer from selective universities compared with their middle class peers that have been to private school, even when they have the same grades. So it's not a difference of grades. It was the personal statement and the reference that was making a difference there to those offer rates. The issue with that research is it is a bit dated. It's based on data that's 20 to 30 years old. So it's debatable how relevant that is to now, but that's the best that we've got at the moment, that it does seem to make a difference. So again, just for some context, these are the 3 new questions that UCAS is moving to. This is something that we'll be talking about again and again in our presentations. So question 1, why do you want to study this course or subject? Question 2, have your qualifications and studies helped you prepare for this course or subject? And number 3, what else have you done to prepare outside of education, and why are these experiences useful? That's what UCAS have come up with. These questions are fixed. These, I've been told, are what is going to go ahead. This is going to happen. So the questions are fixed, but the guidance around them is not. And the ways in which we're going to advise students on how to tackle these 3 questions and the relative weights that you might give to them, that has not yet been finalized. That is in the process. So the questions are finalized, but the guidance and how we tackle it has not been, and that's something that we can be talking about today as well. One quick thing to highlight, again, it's still 4,000 characters, and you can divide those up however you want amongst those 3 questions. I personally think that some of those are much more important than others. That's something we can come back to. But it is very much splitting the old 4,000 character essay into 3, because it's still the 4,000 character. And yeah, you can divide it however you want. Now, for me, just to kind of flag from the beginning, there's some clear risks here, I think. I think that if there's an ambiguity of what you include in what section, there's maybe stress that's involved there for applicants and for teachers and advisors. So that's where the guidance becomes particularly important to make sure that it's really clear what each of those questions should be doing. And that's something that we need to work out how to do that. And then secondly, I think there's a real risk with this second question because it focuses on qualifications. What we don't want there is we don't want a paragraph that says, I did this in my A-level, I learned this generic skill. I did this in my A-level, I learned this generic skill. I did this in my A-level, I learned this generic skill. That is not what we want. That is not going to get you offers from university, but there's a risk that people interpret that question in that way. Okay, so that was everything from myself.
So I'm going to move to the next section, and I'm going to briefly introduce colleagues who have responsibility for overseeing the transition from Sixth form into university admissions, starting with Hugh Peters, who is teaching and careers advisor in the UK recruitment team at the University of Manchester.
Yeah, that's me. Hello, everyone. So if any teachers and advisors want any support directly from the university, let me know and I can try and help. I have my colleague Sophie at the back who was trying to hide probably. She was one of the managers in our access team as well. So I think I'm here to represent universities and admissions in general. So I apologise in advance for this. I will do my best. I've drawn these resources from Advancing Access, which is the kind of widening access elements of the Russell Group. So although this is kind of from the Russell Group, it is relevant to all university admissions processes, I hope, but probably a little bit more from a selective perspective. So we're going to cover, not repeating anything as Tom said, thankfully. So starting off with the basics. So this is a summary of what different universities have been looking for in the current structure for the personal statement. So for 2025 or entry or earlier. And so some of the different examples of what they've done. In general, these are what we're trying to aim to get from the personal statement. We're trying to understand the person, the student that's applying, their potential, their suitability for the course, understand their preparation, understanding of the subject that they're going for, whether that's in terms of skills or knowledge of what that course will involve for the next period of time that they're doing. Generally, we want to see that they're able to succeed on that course. We want them to do well. We want them to stay with us. And it's one of the pieces of evidence that will allow us to do that. And it's another tool that universities use to kind of differentiate or compare and contrast candidates, which may lend itself into some of the issues that Tom's already outlined there. So University of Manchester, we're the most applied to university in the UK. And unfortunately, if you ask me any questions, depends will be the first answer I say to any of those. So I will do my best. And so you can see that's even more problematic when it comes to looking at admissions in a bigger scale. So these are a few examples. For example, looking at Cambridge, they will base one of their decision around the interview and the questions and the content of that interview sometimes on the format and content of the personal statement. And so it's very much about the subject knowledge. It's very much about their enthusiasm, about their motivation. Again, all very subjective, all very florid language potentially. Things like Glasgow for veterinary science, it is increasingly more powerful tool for more competitive subjects, because again, it's one of the ways that the student is telling us about them. It's their chance to get across their point of view. And again, looking at somewhere like Warwick, it's very much allowing them to select potential course students using the criteria that we've mentioned previously. However, it is used in very different ways depending on the subject. So for example, Bristol, for medicine, don't use the personal statements as part of their admissions process. This is also in line with what Manchester does. So we're no longer using the personal statement as part of our selection process for medicine. We're using a variety of other things like the UCAS and the GCSE grades instead. So this is very much a moving process. It's very much an evolving thing. Leeds, again, general advice, it's an important part of it. It's a holistic view that they will take, and that's a typical example of what they would do. And it's one of the factors that we will use. It is again, the most subjective, it's their chance to get their point of view across, but it will always be used in the context of the contextual admissions processes that university will have, access themes that they will have, the predicted grades, the course that they're applying for. It's a huge range of things, but certainly an important piece of evidence that is there. So in terms of kind of standing out or kind of being more kind of supporting students and kind of looking at what they're trying to see, the kind of things that we will be looking for is generally focusing a little bit more, and this won't apply to all courses, but generally heading a bit more towards the super curricular. So things like wider reading, kind of supporting critical reflection, going into kind of, and this is kind of more the traditional format of a personal statement than kind of what it's kind of turning into, which I'll expand on in a second. And again, with most of the personal statement, quite often we're focusing on quality of what they're talking about rather than listing everything they've ever done. We would much rather have stronger, more helpful, more reflective examples of what they're looking for. Work experience can be an element that can be included in the personal statement. Again, different universities will have different policies around this. Again, as an example for Manchester, trying not to bang on about us, but in general, we try not to have work experience as a requirement for the majority of our courses. So very few courses will need that. And so therefore it's kind of a nice to have. Not saying it won't influence the decision, but it shouldn't be necessarily a barrier to allowing students to progress into university. And again, that extracurricular versus supercurricular, we generally, for the majority of courses, not all courses, more focused on subject knowledge and that understanding. Again, focusing on the reading that they're doing and kind of narrowing it down to the subject itself. And again, that's part of what we're looking for from the personal statement, is it being as specific as possible to the course that they're going for and not broadening out their options. I think the most extreme example I ever saw when doing a personal statement checking session was someone trying to do journalism, dentistry, and geography. I think it was 3 pages long to start off with. But again, part of what we're trying to say is that they have a solid understanding and motivation, passion and enthusiasm in that subject. And again, it's not having to tell us what they're doing, and particular risks about the academic of just listing and tell us the syllabus of what they're currently studying. That again doesn't help us. It's perhaps a more individual and personal reflection that is more useful. So hopefully that was useful. So in terms of some academic examples, these are some things that might be useful in kind of guiding your students down in terms of free resources or things that the students can access, because it doesn't need to be about connections and advantages. There are many ways that students can supplement and support their application. This will apply for the new format as well as the old. MOOCs, online courses, very much a way to kind of expand on a subject area or the topic that they're interested in, kind of shows them going over and above just what they're being taught. Academic articles, again, supplementing that further reading, complementing their academic study at the moment. Online courses that universities will offer. UCAS Spring Pod, which allows students to access a series of taster lectures about subject areas, completely accessible to everyone, but it's a useful tool to encourage students to engage with. I always suggest that before they do anything else, students should look and make the most of the UCAS hub and all the resources that UCAS make available to students, because that's applicable to every university that they're going to be considering going to. Subject tasters, and again, that might in part depend on where they're living and their access to local universities and the provision that those universities will have, but trying to take that opportunity to see what is out there, and things like virtual work experience, where there's less barriers, less connections, more opportunities sometimes to take advantage of that. And for those courses that do require work experience, in general, we've got more flexible about what work experience we're looking for and the format that takes. So again, for medicine, for example, they would accept a combination of virtual and in-person experience. So we're getting the skills that they're looking for without requiring them to have spent so much time that they may not have been able to do because of other commitments that would have acted as barriers to them. So 2026 and beyond, so this is the future. So the kind of things that we'll be looking for, I'm not going to reiterate what Thomas said, but broadly, these are some of the things that we suggest might be useful to emphasize in those 3 questions. The why is the obvious part of that. So that clear motivation for studying that course and that critical reflection on why this is a good subject for them. That's a really important part of it. And when I used to look at a lot of applications, which I've seen in my time, that was what we wanted to make sure it's generally a good indication of whether a student is going to want to stick out to the duration of their course and their understanding of it, and that knowledge of what that subject can include. And that could be quite detailed. I'm not saying we want to explain the entire structure of a degree, but the nuances of what a course might include is really important. So for example, when I did admissions, when I worked in social sciences, I used to look at admissions for particular courses like economics, and it's things like their understanding and knowledge of mathematical elements of economics or mathematics in general is such a key skill on that degree that we would have kind of expected that to be outlined as some part of the personal statement, because almost if you didn't grasp that in advance, that was going to cause problems down the line. Future plans, aspirations, that's a great thing to include with balance, because I've seen personal statements that end up being job application in many ways. So there is a balance between aspiration and kind of focusing on that motivation, which is good. In general, as Tom alluded, not just listing what they're currently studying and a generic skill, but more how that relates to what they're doing. Relevance is a really important element of personal statements in general, so tying as much as they can of their personal statement into the course that they're applying for in general. This is generally good advice. And trying to reflect on the most transferable and useful skills that tie into that course in particular, and anything else that they've done that could be a chance to talk about other qualifications like the extended project, other things that will relate but not be directly in that course as well, so that might be useful. And then section 3, things like that work experience, employment, volunteering, all really useful things. It might give transferable skills, but again, the relevance and value really will depend on the subject that they're applying for and kind of what they're looking to do. Other things like their own life experiences, responsibilities might come in, the motivation. They could have a personal reason why they want to do that course, but that would be another opportunity to include it in that section. And then hobbies and extracurricular. And the amount that you'll include of those will really depend on what that course needs and kind of the reflections on the skills that would be most useful, where, for example, in healthcare sciences, we'll be looking at kind of resilience and a different skill set than someone who's interested in maybe physics. So it's about tailoring it as best as possible. So they're just a few things that may be considered in each of the 3 sections, although we're still finalising our guidance as a university. So we're aiming, whether it will happen soon, I don't know, but we're aiming to try and customize guidance about the personal statement for all of our courses. That might be a little while off coming, but at least there will be some general guidance that we'll try and create that can give a broad picture. And our team are going to be going out and speaking to colleges and schools around what the university's approach is to all of this. So watch this space. So that was me. Hopefully I did that in enough time and not too long. Any questions? Anything you want to ask? Stunned silence. I'm not sure that's the effect I want to go for, but that's fine. There'll be chances.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we don't. A really specific question about Manchester and kind of how many applicants.
Yeah, how many applicants per place do you get?
Yeah.
10 to 1 roughly. So we are the most applied to university UK, so around 80 to 90,000 applications. For undergraduate, around 9,000 places, roughly speaking. That isn't uniform, so some courses will be, like, for example, dentistry is 1,000 to 60 places. So it's very variable. Other courses will have a much higher likelihood of getting an offer, but that's the big numbers at least.
Why would dentistry be a popular? It doesn't seem like a really glamorous.
So yeah, they're increasingly vocational. Well, that sounds, yeah, no, optometry, healthcare, I mean, healthcare is clearly, we need them, please get encouraged to do it. But personally, I have no desire to do any of that. I think it's around changes in terms of what subjects students are taking originally. So it's increasingly science-based, STEM-based subjects, increasingly what students are taking, and the desire for an undergraduate degree to lead to something really obvious. So dentistry and medicine, lesser extent, something like nursing is an obvious career path, whereas we have to make that harder argument for other subject areas. So art history is fantastic, but it's harder to make that discussion sometimes. Fantastic. Any questions you can ask me in the meantime, but I will pass on. No problem.
And this is Hannah who's social balance and food advisor and water, with things like the water education.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak from a different perspective, from a practitioner's perspective, kind of on the ground perspective. I think it's really useful to see what we think, perhaps, of what the new system of personal statements will look like when our students actually get the opportunity to approach it in a very different way. So we are a multi-academy trust. We have 4 sixth forms within that trust, and where I'm based, we have 310 students in the sixth form. All of our students will apply to university, the vast majority will go. We have a strong push on Russell Group universities, but not exclusively. So we're really interested in what it's going to look like, not least because we've spent a huge amount of time and energy and resources in, we feel, mastering the 4,000 character personal statement, and now to have to change after all that investment feels like quite a big deal. So I've kind of broken this down into what I think will be our really substantial wins, and I would say that very definitely we are really pleased with this. We absolutely welcome this change. To some extent, we also welcomed the reference change, although we haven't been able to embrace this in the way that I think universities and UCAS wanted us to embrace it. We still use almost all of our characters. Perhaps that wasn't quite the intention, but we definitely do, just to kind of dot all the I's and cross all the T's. In terms of the wins then about breaking this down, so I've got some very personal and current experience of this, and I think actually just being asked this question of why you want to study a particular subject, I think is fantastic, because firstly, this question of why do you want to study that? And that should be such a directly answered question, and yet so rarely is that the case. And these rather strange responses for history or English literature or physics is often okay. But to give you an example, beauty is a natural desire is the first line of a student who's applied to dentistry this year, that very, very, very competitive course of dentistry. She was unshakable. However many times I said to her, why do you want to study dentistry, Charlotte? Every single time she replied, beauty is a natural desire. I feel if UCAS had asked her that question rather than me, perhaps she would have answered it more directly. So I am hoping that a more direct question will elicit a more direct answer, and actually an answer to that question. The second thing I think is really important there is the idea of studying a subject. If you are choosing to apply for law at university, you are choosing to read law for 3 years. You are not applying at that point to become a barrister or a solicitor. And I think this is a real opportunity to really focus minds and to avoid that, something of a job application. I think that's really useful as well. Then on to those second and third questions, and I think there are a number of issues. I think, Tom, you're absolutely right, that kind of sense of which box do I put, kind of which ideas in. We do lots of work on supercurricular activities and reflection on those activities. And does that fit into question 1 or question 2? I will be telling students that doesn't matter, that it's about exploring those experiences and conveying their ideas and their understanding of the course and what they want to do with that and why they're passionate about that study. But I fear that they then won't believe me about that. So I'll have swapped, kind of one problem for another problem potentially. I do think the language, though, of why have these experiences been helpful to avoid that kind of list making that students often go down. They've done so much in some cases. I think there is an opportunity here to really focus mind again on the skills aspects of that. Now I am a teacher, and there will always be a challenge. There will always be something that we're kind of dissatisfied with. We are critical people, I think, and critical in a number of different ways. Some of it being really positive and some of it being less so. I do think there are some enduring challenges, some unintended consequences from this, but just also some problems that persist. The language that's used for us as professionals to explain what these 3 questions mean at the moment is absolutely suitable for educational professionals. There's no problem with that whatsoever. Unfortunately, the language that UCAS tends to use is the same for those professionals as it is for students applying to university. So I ran what they say about the explanation, and it's fairly short, very sweet, and I think actually very understandable explanation of these 3 questions through this score. And it absolutely says that it's not plain English. It's actually difficult to read. It's of a university standards of education required to be able to unpick what these sentences mean. So definitely it is my hope, and both of you have mentioned that already, that there will be lots of guidance from universities about what to put in these different parts of this personal statement. I think that's definitely something to consider, and particularly when other institutions such as the NHS have spent so much time and resource on making sure that, you know, the language they are using very definitely is plain English. I hope UCAS kind of follow suit and make sure that that is really accessible. I think again we've mentioned this idea, and Tom, you kind of drew it as you know, kind of a biggest box, a smaller box, and then a much smaller box. I think there's again a huge potential for students to fill in the section that I know definitely my students can write about till the end of time, which is their kind of extracurricular activities. Particularly if they are involved in lots of different things, they want to talk about that a lot, which is obviously wonderful, but Oxbridge particularly have always said, you know, this should be the real kind of minority aspects in terms of character count. So again, we will need to be really, really clear about that. I think also that these questions are abstract anyway, and so students have always needed support. We've used Causeway Education's Oscar platform for a number of years now, and Hannah's going to talk more about that in a moment, and that's been fantastic, but it hasn't solved the problem for every student. That some students find this really inaccessible, and they don't know what to write, and they don't know how to engage in curricular activities, they don't know how to reflect on those things, and so those things will definitely be an enduring problem. And like anything that is new, anything which has changed, as professionals we will definitely need support, and our students will continue to need support as they always have done. So I think that's my biggest concern. And I think my colleagues' biggest concern is we want to do the absolute best by our students every single time. We want to enable them and facilitate them to make fantastic applications, because we know that they are fantastic. So we need to help them over this kind of final hurdle, if you like. They've got great GCSEs, they've done loads of reading, they're really, you know, they're super keen, they've done their research on their courses. This is the final hurdle. Obviously, they've got to get great results at the end as well. But we need to feel that we're in a really good position to help them to do that. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Hannah to tell you a little bit about what Causeway Education are doing on this front.
So I'm here to represent Causeway Education. They're not my current employer, but I think once you've lived in the charity sector, you never really leave. So I'm here to kind of highlight and spotlight the charity and what they do. So for those of you who don't know, we are a national social mobility charity, and I suppose the main mission is to ensure that academic progression is not determined by privilege. which is so key for us, and obviously sadly not the case. Causeway aim to equip young people as well as those who support them with the kind of the knowledge, the tools, the confidence to make the right choices and applications for post-18 destinations. So very much rooted in social mobility and social justice. And I think, obviously, as you know, the need for charities like ours remains unwaveringly high, and persistently high, as does, you know, conversations like these. But the gap between access between under-resourced students and their state school peers is just the biggest on record. So this is Lee Elliott Major. He's first professor we have of social mobility at the University of Exeter. And he says all the key indicators of social mobility are flashing red, driven by that perfect storm of rising child poverty, persistent school absenteeism, and deepening financial hardships among university students. So we know that context is there, and that's why we as a charity exist. As Tom said before, private A-level students are now twice as likely to enter elite universities compared to their state school peers. And that's so worrying because a degree can be so transformative. It can be so transformative for so many people. So access to higher education needs to be as equitable as possible. So we as a charity very much welcome these changes. It's a good step. It's not all the way, but it's a positive first step. We've been advocating for about 10 years to schools and colleges across the country that a structured approach needs to be taken to the personal statement. We need that structure and that scaffolding. And we do this through our online system for completing applications and references, which we call OSCAR for short. And it provides that framework for sort of planning and writing and coordinating the UCAS reference. And we provide that free to all state schools. And again, funded, a majority funded by the Sutton Trust. So the approach we promote is based around 4 kind of questions or domains. And as you can see here, we colour code it. So green means go, give us lots of content. Orange, less so, and red, very, very little. When it comes to extracurricular, we really don't want to see anything above sort of 20% in that section. So the first section is, why do you want to study the course in question? And it's that great first question, why? So we have been, you know, promoting this for such a long period of time. And it's the chance for the students to sort of demonstrate their academic passion. For example, a mathematics applicant might kind of talk about the subject-specific skills they've gained and why that means they want to study their course in question. So a mathematics applicant might look at creativity, problem solving, application of logic. So lots of focus really there on subject-specific skills. In the second section, you can see here it's our biggie, and both Hugh and Tom talked about it earlier, but it's how do you develop your skills through key areas of interest? And that's otherwise known as our topic of interest paragraph. So here students kind of refer to academic wider reading or other relevant practical study in order to sort of demonstrate their ability to apply those skills effectively in their own time. You know, and that's where the kind of wider research and analysis comes in as well. And our research, particularly with Manchester, shows that the evidence of wider reading or analysis is exactly what admissions teams are looking for. And as I said, this should be the most detailed, it should be the longest section. And on OSCAR, students are guided through this section step by step, so that they have access to kind of visuals as well as individual questions throughout that section. Then we go on to 3 and 4, which obviously you can see are less so. So 3 is course-related activities and how those and the learnings from those and how those skills they can use to support them as a student. And finally, extracurricular, which we want to know less about, but it's still of interest. How have they perhaps prepared students for life as a student? So we're looking at kind of talking about an extracurricular activity, but then the skill they've gained from it, communication, time management, etc., that will support them for their journey as a student in their chosen pathway. As you can see, these are not dissimilar at all to those new questions that are posed by UCAS. And I suppose backed by that academic research that we've invested in, Causeway know that this structured approach has many, many benefits. So we're really, we very much welcome these changes, although they're certainly not enough. Firstly, that scaffolding gives them structure. And as we've said before, structure to what can be a really challenging piece of writing. If you told me to sit down and write 4,000 characters without any support, any hand-holding, I'd struggle. It's exactly the same for students, especially in an environment where scaffolding from Key Stage 2 and lower is so kind of inbuilt in their area of study. They're so used to having this structure all the time. And previous UCAS research suggested that 79% of students reported that process of writing the statement was difficult to complete without support. So 79% of students who complete the personal statement say this is difficult. We need support. Also, structure helps to relieve that stress, which we mentioned earlier, not only for the students, but for those people supporting them. Causeway we all believe that personal writing of the personal statement should be such a positive step. It's the student's first step in kind of proclaiming their academic passion and their motivation for study in their future career. For making that tangible as well. It should be a wonderful piece to write. And I suppose it's a way of sort of celebrating and marking their academic achievements to date. But we know, sadly, that under-resourced students are going to have less access to role models who may have completed something similar in the past, and may feel certainly less confident around writing academic pieces of writing. So that's particularly important for under-resourced students. So we want to alleviate stress as much as possible. And finally, it really helps admissions teams pinpoint exactly what they're looking for. When they are looking at personal statements and they have very little time to review them, they know exactly where they're looking for that information. So we've noted through research that that's particularly useful. So as I said, this software that we provide is free to all state schools, and it really focuses students' attention on academic skills and their passion and motivation for studying the course. And it handholds as they kind of navigate this experience. It has tutorials, it has videos, it has written content. So there's lots to support students from kind of a neuro-inclusive perspective. And it also obviously aims to simplify the process for tutors as well. We also have a tool for combining and gaining reference feedback so that it can all be done on the same system very easily. To date, OSCAR has supported over 400 state schools, and in 2020 we surveyed students who used it to find out the impact. 96% of students felt that OSCAR helped them write a better personal statement. It's the data we hold when we kind of talk about spreading this as much as possible across the country. It is free, and almost 100% of students find it beneficial. So as UCAS's changes are implemented, obviously we will continue to provide that support free to state schools, guiding them as they go through it. But as Helen alluded to, we know that one of the biggest challenges here will be supporting teachers who then effectively cascade that information down to students. So that's where we come in. We offer that training and support as well on using the programme. So please do get in touch with us. If you email or you can call, one of the team will set you up on the programme, or they can just give you a guide and tutorial. Another option is just to get set up for yourself as a kind of a single user, and you can look at the system and navigate it that way. It depends how you want to use the system, but it is free. Helen and I are both on LinkedIn, so if you want to follow us or need any more advice, or you have any questions, please do get in touch. Thank you.
Questions now, and if you would like to answer the team problems, please go ahead. So do you have any questions for this?
A question or two that we have there leads really seamlessly into what our next speaker is going to talk about, which is great. So in this section, we're going to hear from researchers, academic researchers who are looking into some of these questions from different perspectives. Beginning with, I'm going to reintroduce, I should have done a better job before, the expert. Tom Fry, really get these questions. So Tom Fry, researcher at the University of Manchester, lecturer as well. Interested in, we have many interesting conversations. I think how you phrased it and what you said was really nice. The kind of how the opportunities for, how did you phrase it? The opportunities for.
I pitch it now. My research looks at how we transform an inequitable education system.
Yeah,
That's
really
my
lovely.
current pitch.
Yeah, but I think really amazing kind of research program, really seeing how can we kind of really identify the really specific places where inequality is being reproduced and what can we do really practically to kind of change that. So yeah, really interesting work around personal statements and also with some work with admissions practitioners themselves, and that's what was going to talk to us about.
Thanks. I also didn't realise there was a clicky
I
thing.
tried to do my own thing and I was like, I'll actually explain it.
There we go. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about transparency, the use of UCAS personal statements, like specifically trying to pick out what are some of the practical messages from my research. I'm not going to bore you on the methodology with too much detail there. So there's two things or two studies that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is a survey of admission staff and how they use the UCAS personal statements. That was from various different providers. And then a recent piece that I've just done that came out last week was an analysis to see a university's transparent about how they're using the UCAS personal statement. In other words, if you're looking at public-facing guidance, would you be able to work out what was happening? So those are the two things I'm going to be talking about, those two studies. So the survey that I did, so it was a survey of admissions professionals in January 2023. Just over 100 responses to that from around about 31 different universities. So I didn't require people to tell me which institution they were from if they felt like they didn't want to declare that. So it's around about 30 different providers. And what the survey did was it covered four main things. So what percentage of personal statements are read? How much time do they spend reading a personal statement? What's the personal statement actually used for? What is assessed? And what's the relative importance of the personal statement compared with other factors? So the survey here, all of this data is from people whose day-to-day job involves assessing applications. So this isn't from university managers that will give you a certain perspective, potentially. This was people whose day-to-day job involves doing this, so it is very much an on-the-ground perspective. So what I'm going to do is talk through those four different features of the survey first of all. So in terms of what percentage of a personal statement is read, most admissions officers are reading all of the personal statements for a given course. With the important caveat that's already come up, that there is an automatic filtering process normally, where if somebody does not have offerable grades, then that doesn't even make it through to somebody to read the statement. So even though 72% of cases people are reading all of the personal statements, that is with the caveat that it's those that are offerable. Now, I wish when I did the survey that I asked something about what offerable was considered. I didn't do that, so I don't have that data, unfortunately. But even in that case, there were definitely some instances where some people said that they read very few or absolutely no of the personal statements for recruiting for that course, and that was 9% of admissions staff that said that. So in general, personal statements are read, but it's people with offerable grades. And those processes likely differ between different universities as well. So what is offerable at one university might be different to another. It's likely to be variation there. So in terms of the time people are spending, personal statements are read really quickly. The number one word in admissions processes is efficiency. We're getting towards 900,000 applicants, so efficiency is the number one word from a university perspective, from an admissions perspective. So the median time spent reading was 2 minutes. The Russell group, that dropped to 90 seconds. 4 in 10 were read for 1 minute or less. So they're read incredibly quickly. It's important from that, there's only certain things that you can judge in that amount of time. There's only certain things that you can judge in a reliable way in that amount of time as well. So that's just really important context. There were some that were read for a really long time. There was one instance of being read for about 20 minutes, but massive anomaly. What is the personal statement used to assess? So I gave people a list of different options and said, well, what are you actually using the personal statement for? So you'll notice that, oh, can I make this go click? Yeah, I can. Okay, so interest in the course, 88% of admission staff are using the personal statement for that reason. And I do think you can probably glance through a statement and you can start to assess, has somebody got some kind of interest in and understanding of the course in that amount of time? I'm surprised by what came next. So to identify mitigating circumstances or relevant contextual information, 65%. So that might be somebody declaring a particular circumstance that had impacted their academic journey. And it was interesting to me that admission staff were using the personal statement as one source for that information, because there's not always, I don't think it's made clear that that is how the personal statement is used. Should be said that as we move forward into 2026, there's a new question that will go on the admissions form, the UCAS form, that does explicitly ask about mitigating circumstances. So it is likely that maybe moving forward, universities might be looking at that question rather than the reformed personal statement for that information. So that's where this might just be a little bit out of date. Again, I was surprised by the third. So to assess academic potential, 40%. So 60% of universities are not using the personal statement to assess academic potential. I was surprised by that. I thought that might have been a little bit higher. And I think it's telling that admissions are looking at grades as a more reliable and valid indicator of someone's academic potential than a long form essay where they've had really variable access to support on that. So I was surprised that was as low as it was, but it's interesting to note that it's only in a minority of cases it's used to assess academic potential. And then many of these other things were used in also in a minority of cases. So aspects around work experience and extracurricular activities. You're looking at, less than 30% using for some of those things. So that's how people are using the personal statement. Oh, let me just do that. So in terms of the relative importance of the personal statement, and this links to the question from the back, the main message is frustrating from an advisor perspective. There is considerable variation in how important the UCAS personal statement is, and there's no real simple way of summarizing it. So sometimes for really selective courses, the personal statement is important, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes at the Russell group, it's really important, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes at vocational courses, it's really important, and sometimes it's not. So the main message that I found from the data, because I broke some of this down by vocational, non-vocational, Russell group, non-Russell group, is just there's incredible variation, and you still have roughly 50% of people saying it's significant, 50% of people saying it's not significantly impacting decisions. So that is incredibly frustrating from a teacher advisor perspective, because you don't really know if the personal statement for this course is going to have a significant impact or not. And that's just such a difficult message to convey through to students, but unfortunately that's where we are. The one small trend in that direction was that it is true that for some vocational courses, people sometimes very strongly agreed that the personal statement was important for that vocational course. But still, overall, if you look at agree and strongly agree, it was still about 50%. So for some vocational courses, it's super important, but there's still a lot of vocational courses where it's not. So that's frustrating as an answer to give you about what the data shows, but there's incredible diversity in the importance of the personal statement. At least it's coming through from this survey. So some key takeaways from that. So the majority of personal statements are read with the asterisk of it's when there's offerable grades. But when they are read, they're skimmed very quickly, so they're mainly used to assess applicants' interest in a course and they've understood what that topic is about. That's the main thing that it's used for, and in a minority of cases, it might be used to assess things like academic potential or relevant skills. But again, incredible variation in the significance of the personal statement, and I wish I could tell you that it's this kind of course where it's important and it's this kind of course where it's not important. There's just not a simple pattern that I can share with you in that way. There's incredible variation across the sector. So that variation across the sector got me thinking about a second study, because what I wanted to do was I wanted to compare the staff responses to this survey to guidance that universities are providing. So what are these courses saying about how they use the personal statement? And if there's not course specific information, what is the university saying about how they use the personal statement? And essentially I was asking, is there an alignment between how people are actually using UCAS personal statements and the public facing guidance? And if there is a misalignment, what is the nature of that misalignment? So are staff using the personal statements in ways that are not described on the websites, or are the websites telling people to do a bunch of stuff that's then actually not assessed? So this study allowed me to start to unpack some of this, and like I say, it came out about a week ago. So this was the key finding from the paper. So it's not a super kind of intuitive table to interpret, so I'll talk you through it. I had many conversations with people about how do I make this better, but this is what I came up with. So essentially, we've got some of the different uses of the personal statement. On the, oh no, I pressed the wrong one.
Oh, what was that button? Was it starting on again?
Hey, there we go.
Yeah, bottom ways that bottom one will turn the screen off.
Yeah.
So don't touch
Good.
that.
So on the left-hand side, essentially what some of this data is here is this is when there's an alignment between how the personal statement is used and the university website. In other words, there's agreement between how it's used and what the website says. So that's this data on this side. As you look at it on the right-hand side, this is where there's a misalignment. In other words, where there's a difference between what admissions tutors are using the personal statement for and what the website says. So what I found was that if you look at the top bit, applicants' interests, 89% of cases, there's alignment. In other words, people are assessing applicants' interest in the course, and the university website said, yeah, we're using the personal statement this way. So that looks pretty good. So there is transparent information on there that essentially applicants should be demonstrating their interest in the course. It gets messier and it gets less transparent, or there's less alignment when it comes to many of the other factors. So draw your attention to these three numbers over here. So in 78% of cases for transferable skills, 59% of cases for broader personal traits, and 57% of cases for academic potential, staff were not assessing that, but the guidance on the university website advised students to be including some of that material in their personal statements. Part of the reason for that is because there wasn't course-specific information. So there was very few instances where there was a course and there was specific information about how the personal statement would be used for that specific program. Instead, it tended to be university-wide guidance that was aimed at helping people just to produce a personal statement, not necessarily a personal statement specific to an institution. So there ended up being all of this advice to include these things that then are not used by admission staff. So the key message to take away from this, I would say, is that as an advisor, when you are interpreting some of the information on university websites, bear in mind that just because they mention it does not mean that that is assessed within that program. It is a more general guidance. Now, I would personally say that that is a lack of transparency. I think that there should be course-specific information about how the UCAS personal statement is used what it is specifically used to assess. And that can sit alongside more general guidance about what a good personal statement looks like. But I think this data shows there's considerable potential for greater transparency on the part of universities. I'm sharing this quickly and I may or may not have time. What I did, because this data I couldn't pick out specific universities, I had to keep it anonymous because of my survey. What I did was I picked 15 business studies courses at random and then assessed the transparency of those university websites. And I picked out some key features of what that transparency would look like. So information about who reads it, about in what circumstances it's read, about the relative importance, and then specific things on what's assessed, what are they not assessing, how are they using contextual admissions alongside a personal statement. And what I did was I basically rated the transparency of the information on the websites by red, amber, green. So red when there was misleading or no information, amber when there was some information, but it was a bit shy, and green, technical term, that's what and green when there was really transparent, open information. And you can see the majority is red and amber. There's very few instances of course-specific information that gives transparent information about how the personal statement is used. So for me, as the personal statement is changing and being reformed and universities are going through a process of adapting their guidance, there is so much potential to be shifting the dial here a little bit. So shifting to be much more transparent. So again, some key takeaways from this. There's a mismatch between university websites and how admissions staff use that in practice. Universities don't always provide course-specific information about personal statements. That was in 7% of cases from the very small sample that I had in those two studies. Many universities say little or nothing about how the personal statement is incorporated into admissions processes and the specific competencies it's used to assess. But we're at a time where we can start to address that because we're going to have to revisit that guidance anyway. So some key implications and takeaways for yourselves in the room as teachers and advisors. The personal statement does significantly impact admissions decisions in 50% of courses. Can't tell you much more than that, sorry. That's just what it is. And there's not the transparent information for you to know which one that is. That is frustrating. That is where we're at now, unfortunately. The most important thing an applicant can do is demonstrate their interest in the course. 88% of cases, that was what was assessed. Other things, it was only a minority of cases. But it is true that demonstrating academic potential, some transferable skills and other competencies were important to a minority of courses. And again, as you're reading university websites, they give you some indication of what the university is going to do, but they do tend to advise applicants to include a bunch of things that actually then is not going to be assessed. So it's worth bearing that in mind because I think it can sometimes be stressful for applicants that feel like they have to do so many things in the personal statement. What I want to do is drive home this message that it is primarily used to assess interest in the course and understanding of the course. That for me would be a reason to be slightly less stressed about that document. That's something that's going to be scrutinized in tons of detail. So thanks. Here's some links to those two studies that have informed some of that. I really should have mentioned this at the beginning. I didn't do it by myself. I did it with colleagues. So Steve Jones and Bowen Chang has been working with me on some of these as well.
I'm sure the friends in the room. I think we're going to go straight on top line speaking of really pleased to announce Elizabeth Brown, from the University of Nottingham, finally a PhD student, originally from the US, now living in the UK. So Elizabeth's interest in some of those maybe differences, but in terms of the PhD specifically, really working with applicants themselves, students themselves. About some of the nuts and bolts, I think, of kind of actually writing kind of linguistic elements, which I think is really, really interesting to drill down into. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, no worries. Are you happy to speak? Yes, that's fine. So yeah, I'll be talking about my PhD project, which is wrapping up now. I'll just go ahead and get started. So My study was seeking to answer the question of how diverse students conceptualize an ideal applicant to university, and then how they perform as this ideal, and whether or not these performances differ based on their socioeconomic and cultural configuration. So there are two dimensions to the entire study. There's a conceptual dimension and a performative dimension. So conceptually, I wanted to figure out how a student imagines an ideal, what makes an ideal university applicant. And by studying this, you can get some insight into how certain traits and behaviors and experiences are perceived as more valuable in various circumstances and across social boundaries. So it was really interesting because a few traits appeared fairly ubiquitously across the sample. But the way that the students performed those traits were very, very different. And that did depend a lot on socioeconomic and cultural configuration. So by researching this, we can get some insights into how sociological factors will tie into not only an understanding of an ideal, but also how that ideal is performed. So my sample, oh my gosh, I needed 16 to 18-year-old students who were applying to university. They had to be going to schools that were Ofsted evaluated so that I could have a benchmark comparison for each of the schools. I got 49 students total across 5 institutions. There was a range of backgrounds, although participants were very skewed in terms of females and were vastly outnumbering males. The participants undertook 3 activities. There was a worksheet where I said, can you outline, just draw me an ideal, tell me what your ideal university applicant looks like. And they would do that, they would write it, they would draw it. I asked them to explain their outline, why they included what they did. And then I had some role reversal queries where I basically said, imagine you're an admissions officer and someone came up to you with these questions, how would you answer them? Then I asked them to draft a personal statement and explain what they included in that draft and why they included it. So that was when they could say, oh, my teacher told me to do this, or oh, my parent told me to do this. And also to explain what they didn't include and why they didn't include that information. The final element was a mock interview, and they were semi-structured mock interviews. I had a set of questions, but they were tailored to the students, so their interest, the subject that they were studying. So I found some very interesting things. First of all, you can see the variation here. I'm going to be using the example of a trait that was fairly ubiquitously recognized across the participants in the study, which was that the university ideal was sociable. They were a friendly individual. But the way that these students, performed the sociable trait was very different. So you have Mona at the top here, and she talked about being sociable in terms of work, communication, confidence, listening well. That was all in her worksheet. It didn't appear beyond the worksheet. Shiloh talked about being understanding and listening. She talked about how her work at a trekking center with horses, she talked to other people, and that built her familiarity with engaging with other people. And then there's Katya, and Katya talked about being kind, caring, and respectful as part of an ideal. She gave this evidence about needing to communicate with them in different ways, specifically in the midwifery field with other colleagues. She talked about predominant legislation involved in practice, and just looking at them, there's a lot of difference in terms of the way they're performing the same trait. So what I did is I created a novel analytical framework to evaluate the performative aspect of my study. So essentially I broke these previous moves or these previous performances here into 3 separate moves. You have essence, substantiation, and contextualization. And these were the 3 traits that I talked about in my PhD because they were fairly ubiquitously recognized. Hardworking, sociable, passionate. I'm only focusing on sociable right now. So with the essence move, it's a real question and answer type situation. So the student perceives a need to say, they perceive the question. The university says, what makes you an ideal applicant? And the student says, well, I'm friendly, I'm sociable. And I am gonna put that down and I check that box and I've done the task, I've completed the task. Then you have substantiating students. And these are the students that say they see a need to identify themselves as the ideal. And they also perceive a need to substantiate that claim, to provide evidence for that claim. So they'll then say,
I'm sociable. I'm sociable because I work at a trekking center and I talk with customers frequently. But then you get these contextualizing students, and these are the students that can tie everything back together with a nice pretty bow, and they can say, all of these things that I've done are relevant to my university application because I know at university I'll need to talk to professors. I know that when I'm a midwife, I need to abide by this legislation. So they have this really well-developed understanding of what they're applying for. And now I can go into some of the reasons behind this. So the concepts and performances of excellence tend to be based on concepts and performances that an individual has accessed over their lifetime. So the experiences that they have, the people that they interact with, the types of behavioral styles that are seen in everyday life, those leak into the application. So those students that have exposure to university presentation styles are more likely to reproduce them. And equally, their students are more likely to find comfort in the presentation styles that are most familiar. So in an interview, in a personal statement, if they are uncomfortable using academic language or academic behavioral styles, they're going to find it much more uncomfortable to reproduce them during the university application process. And all of these are going to depend on financial stability. Can they afford tutoring sessions? What kind of school do they go to? Their cultural upbringing, the community values, the primary fields of socialization, previous experiences with gatekeepers. And again, it kind of reiterates ideas about what gatekeepers will reward will differ even when students are striving to meet the same criteria and engaging with the same power structures. So largely what I found with the Essence movement, and this one's really hard because it's hard to say why someone didn't do something, but in general, students that use the Essence move had this idea that being sociable was a positive thing. They knew it was good and they would talk about it in that sense, but it was so abstract. It was so hard for them to apply that trait to the university itself. And one of the reasons that previous studies and this one kind of found was that these students tended to have really abstract ideas about the future. They knew they wanted to go to the university. When I said, what makes you want to go? What inspired you to go? They would say, I'm not sure. I don't really know. They also didn't really have social capital to clarify university styles and university ideals in general. When I asked what was your biggest source of support or information, they would say no one, or I went online. They were using a lot of publicly available information that again tends not to be tailored to specific courses. So that was the Essence move. In the substantiation move, the biggest takeaway I found was that there were clear connections between abstract and tangible sociability, and largely those came from workplaces. Students were drawing from personal experiences that they had in a workplace where they could see the evidence that their sociability was beneficial, whether it was through someone telling them to or encouraging them to go into a customer-facing situation so they could develop those skills, or just having access to individuals who would draw that connection for them if they weren't going to organically stumble upon it themselves. So that came out, or the substantiation movement was also apparent for students who had access to resources and opportunities and discourses from actual university resources. There was a student that talked about a Nottingham Trent workshop where the individual running the workshop told them you need to provide evidence for the claims that you make on the application. And that's how that was reflected in their application. This also shows how informational deficits in one environment can be supplemented elsewhere. One of these students, Shiloh, did not have any family members attending university, but she did display this idea that you do need to evidence claims to ideality on your application. So then you have the contextualization students, and these are the students that had these really well-developed understandings of what they were applying to. And usually this came from a unified home to school understanding of universities. There was unified support from both environments to shepherd them into higher education. So Katya her mother was a healthcare professional and before she became a university lecturer. So Katya had experience watching her mother work in her workplace. She discusses the range of sources that, or of support that she had in her interview. She talked about, how she knew that it was important to include the 6 C's in her personal statement, care, compassion, competence, because loads of people told her to keep reiterating it. When I asked her about loads of people, she said, all of my teachers that have looked at it, my mom, when I looked at example personal statements. So she had much more exposure to university similar environments and much more access to university knowledgeable individuals who could then articulate, they knew her as well, so they could articulate the importance of including particular information, and she had access to subject specific skills because she worked in a care home. She was able to imagine sociability with much more nuance. So at this point in the PhD, I'm developing the idea right now, but it's this sense of hidden criteria, that the university has this range of criteria, but the amount of them that you can see will differ by individual. Some people will only see 3 of the 12 criteria. Some will see 8 of the 12 criteria, and it will depend a lot on these socioeconomic and cultural factors that go into it. So this is just the intention of the project, is to add dimension to the way ideals are imagined by individuals and then presented to the university, how these sociological features influence these conceptualizations and performances, with the intention of moving away from this deficit model that places the blame at the feet of the students sometimes, or it can. That is all I have. It's just loads of references.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Do you need, I think you said maybe I need to write off it. Okay, so that's, I'm really glad that it's still gonna be here, so, I have, the next slide is just some maybe suggestions for discussion, but I'm sure people also have, specific questions and comments on those 2 presentations. But when I can get past Elizabeth's references, there we go. So, questions for our 2 comments, discussion around those 2 presentations, but also some things to think about. People in the room who are already supporting students, what do you think works well? What have you found works well supporting students? What do you think about the new changes that we've been talking about? Will they bring more fairness? What would a fairer system look like? This is some of the bigger, these are my interests, always the big philosophical questions. Yeah, so either questions responding to these prompts or in response to either of the papers would be great. Then I want to start.
Suppose I'm assuming I'm going to steal your paper. I mean, we can just control what we have around us, so that would be super fair. Students, the one thing I can find out is that at least take subjects back to my colleagues. So one piece of what we want to do is do that more bespoke course specific thing. So my colleague,